The station had no name worth remembering. It floated in the neutral band between claimed space and open void, like a piece of metal that the universe had simply forgotten to assign a purpose. No flags flew from its hull. No government maintained it. It belonged, technically, to no one, which was precisely why it had become the preferred stage for the Varath Dominion's most important performances. And they were performances. Ambassador Drovak Sen had been putting them on for 27 years. He arrived 4 hours before the scheduled meeting. He always did. The conference chamber on the 3rd level was exactly as he had requested. Long oval table, 7 seats on each side, the viewport angled to show the deeper dark of space rather than the station's cluttered docking arm. Small details, but small details were the architecture of power, and Drovak Sen understood power the way a surgeon understands bone, not just its structure, but its precise points of fracture. He settled into the chair at the head of the table and opened his briefing file on the species called humans. The file was not long. They came from a single planet called Earth, orbiting an ordinary yellow star in a region of the galaxy that the Dominion's cartographers had labeled as sparse and low interest. Their civilization was young, embarrassingly so by any standard used among the 7 Dominion member worlds. They had achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century, which placed them firmly in what Dominion scholars called the stumbling phase, the window in which a species had just enough technology to reach their neighbors, but not nearly enough to threaten them. Their military consisted of fewer than 250 warships. Their weapons were primitive by comparison, solid projectile systems, particle-based, none of the layered energy architecture that gave Dominion vessels their range advantage. Their home system had no defensive grid. Their outer colonies were young and thinly populated. The briefing file used the word underdeveloped 4 times. It used limited twice. It used promising once, buried in a footnote about mineral extraction potential, which said everything about what the analyst had considered worth noting. Drovak Sen set the file face down on the table. The door at the far end of the chamber opened. 3 humans walked in. The first was a woman. She was of moderate height, with dark hair cut close and a posture that reminded Sen of a compressed spring, not tense but dense, carrying energy that was being held rather than used. Her uniform was charcoal gray, with a single designation stripe at the collar. Her name, according to the file addendum, was Yael Davan. She moved into the room the way a person moves through familiar terrain, not cautious, not hurried, but thoroughly aware. Her eyes catalogued the chamber in the first 3 seconds, touching the corners, the viewport, the chair placements, and Sen's face in exactly that order. Behind her came a man with the long, careful stride of someone who had spent time on ships, a slight forward lean, balanced at the hips. He carried a data tablet pressed flat against his arm. His name was Lieutenant Oren Stav. He did not look around the room the way Davan had. He had already finished looking. He simply walked to the table and placed his tablet on its surface with quiet precision.
The third was a woman who stood just inside the doorway after the others had passed her. Warrant Officer Brea Holt. The file had almost nothing on her. Security designation, present for escort purposes. She was broad-shouldered, and still in the particular way that Sen had learned to associate over 27 years of this work with people who had made peace with the worst possible outcomes of a situation before the situation had even begun. She stood beside the door with her hands loose at her sides and her gaze moving in a slow, regular pattern around the room. Not threatening, just watching. "Welcome," Sen said. His translation collar converted the word smoothly. "Please, sit." Davan pulled out the chair directly across from him. She did not take the seat immediately. She turned it 3 degrees, angling herself so that she had clear sight lines to both the table and the door behind her. Then she sat and folded her hands on the table. She did not fidget. Sen had been at this table with representatives of 22 species. Most of them fidgeted. It was involuntary, the nervous system's response to being in a room with someone who held every material advantage. The rearranging of objects, the reaching for water that was not drunk, the small, self-soothing gestures that betrayed the understanding of one's own position. Anxiety was data, and data was useful. Yael Davan gave him nothing. He cleared his throat. "The Varath Dominion has reviewed your government's application for formal recognition and cooperative status within our framework. We have found your civilization to be at an early stage of development. Integration would bring your people significant advantages: trade access, medical technology, navigational rights across Dominion space, and formal protection under Dominion law." Davan nodded once. "And what does the Dominion want in return?" "Standard terms, compliance with Dominion governance codes, a structured taxation arrangement based on your current resource output, and military service contribution when called upon by the Dominion Council." "Military contribution," she repeated. "A standard requirement for all integrated species. It is not unusual." "It's conscription," she said, not angrily, simply accurately. Sen paused for a fraction of a second. "It is contribution to collective security." Davan glanced at Stav. Stav did not look up from the tablet. She looked back at Sen. "I want to make sure I understand you completely. You're asking us to subordinate our right to self-governance, pay taxes to a council we have no voting seat on, and deploy our soldiers wherever that council decides." She paused. "In exchange for access to things we could develop ourselves, given time." "Given a great deal of time," Sen said, "and given the absence of any crisis in that time, which is not a certainty."
"No," she agreed. "And if we decline," Sen folded his hands, "then the nature of the offer changes. In what direction? It becomes considerably less of an offer." The room was very quiet. The ventilation system made a low, constant sound in the walls. Bray Holt, still standing near the door, did not move. She simply continued her slow, steady survey of the room. "Ambassador," Davan said, "I appreciate your directness. I'll match it. We came here because we believe in talking first and letting everything else be a last resort. We are genuinely open to partnership, real partnership, not absorption. We're not here to refuse cooperation. We're here because we want to build something honest." She tilted her head slightly. "We won't sign anything that removes our right to govern ourselves or sends our people into wars they didn't choose. That's not pride talking. That's a hard line." Sen studied her. The words were measured and clear. He had heard versions of this position from the representatives of 9 different species. In 8 of those cases, the position had softened within the allotted review period, as the weight of arithmetic settled over the delegation. Their fleet, his fleet, the distance between them and any help.
One species had not softened, but they had eventually been made to understand through means that the records classified simply as demonstration of intent. He slid a data chip across the table. The full terms are there. You have 40 cycles to review. The Council will expect a response. Davan picked up the chip. She looked at it for a moment, not at Sen, at the chip, with an expression that gave away precisely nothing. Then she set it beside her folded hands. "We'll review everything carefully." "I'd encourage it." He let a thin, practiced smile appear. 40 cycles is a generous window. I suggest your people use it well. She stood. Stav rose beside her, tablet under his arm. As they moved toward the door, Holt stepped aside to let them pass, then glanced back once, not at Sen, but at the room itself, measuring it the way you measure a space you expect to return to. Then the door closed. Sen sat in the quiet. He turned to his first aide. "Read." "Standard resistance posture," the aide said. "They'll review the terms. They'll find that the mathematical reality offers no genuine alternative. They'll return within the window with minor modifications they want on record, so their leadership can claim partial success. We grant 2 or 3 cosmetic points. They sign." Sen nodded. That was how it always went. He opened his session log and wrote that the human delegation had been firm in tone but unrealistic in position, and that if the 40 cycles produced no agreement, a brief fleet movement near their outer colonies would clarify the situation considerably. He marked the file pending and closed it. He did not record, because he did not think it was worth recording, that Commander Yael Davan had sat across from him for 20 minutes and he had not once been able to read her. He told himself it didn't matter. He would think about that later, when everything had already changed, and he would realize that it had mattered from the very first second. The 40 cycles passed. Drovak Sen ate his meals, read his briefings, and waited. The response came on the 39th cycle. It was brief. Commander Davan requested a second meeting. No indication of whether it was acceptance or negotiation. Sen assumed acceptance. They always accepted by now. The arithmetic of the situation was not complicated, and complicated species eventually arrived at simple conclusions. He confirmed the meeting and slept without difficulty. The humans arrived precisely on time. Same 3 people, same quiet entry. Davan angled her chair the same 3 degrees before sitting, and her hands folded on the table with the same stillness as before. Stav set his tablet face down this time, which was a small change Sen noticed and filed away. Holt stood near the door and resumed her patient surveillance of the room. "We've reviewed your terms," Davan said. "And you accept," Sen said. It was almost a question. Almost. "No." 2 of Sen's aides exchanged a glance along the side wall. Sen kept his expression level. "Then what are you proposing, Commander?" Stav turned the tablet over and slid it to the center of the table. Davan reached forward and placed a data chip beside it. "A counter-proposal. Open trade access on equal terms with mutual tariff structures negotiated annually. No conscription. Military cooperation on a voluntary, treaty-specific basis with equal dominion and human authorization required for any joint deployment.
a joint council seat for human representation in any decision affecting human territory or human forces, and a shared intelligence framework on threats that concern both our peoples. She sat back. We sit at the table as partners, not clients. Sen looked at the chip without touching it. You are not positioned to negotiate as partners. We respectfully disagree. Commander. He kept his voice patient. This was the moment where patience was most useful. Ambassador. May I ask you something? Go ahead.
Do you know what Earth's surface gravity is? The question landed strangely. Sen had not expected it. He found himself blinking once before his composure reassembled. It's in your planetary profile, approximately 9.7 meters per second squared. 9.8, she said. Close. And Varath Prime? He knew this without looking. 5.9. So your people, every soldier, every worker, every athlete, every child who has ever run or lifted or trained has done it under 5.9 their entire lives. She paused. Every human who has ever done any of those things has done it under 9.8, a gravitational load 66% heavier than what your people experience as normal. Sen said nothing. He was listening now in a way that was different from before. Stav turned the tablet over and slid it fully across the table. On the screen was a dense comparative document, biological metrics, presented in columns that showed human physiological data alongside 7 species currently serving in the Dominion's military framework. One of Sen's senior aides leaned forward from the wall. Bone mineral density. Human skeletal structures test at impact tolerance levels that exceed 3 of the 7 species on that list by a factor of 2. That's not an anomaly. That's the result of hundreds of thousands of years of gravity and a planet that spent most of its history trying to kill everything living on it. She touched the edge of the tablet without picking it up. Cardiovascular endurance under sustained high-output conditions. Our doctors measured it in hours, not minutes. The Dominion's own military fitness standards define peak performance windows in your best species at around 90 minutes of high-intensity activity. Human soldiers sustain output well beyond that window, routinely in training. Pain response thresholds. She let that phrase sit for a moment. Our own medical researchers still argue about the upper boundary of what a human can function through, because some of the documented cases fall outside what their models said was survivable. The senior aide had risen slightly from his seat. He was reading the document with an expression that was not easy to categorize. The room was very quiet. This is not a threat, she said. I want to be clear about that. We're not sitting here trying to frighten anyone. We're sharing information because we believe this conversation changes if you understand what you're actually looking at when you look at us. She leaned forward just slightly. We are not the underdeveloped species in your briefing file, Ambassador. We are something that your briefing file didn't have the right questions to describe. Sen looked at the data. He looked at it for a long time. Even if every figure here is accurate, it doesn't resolve the disparity in our fleet numbers, he said. You're right. It doesn't change the count. It changes the cost of what a conflict between us would actually mean for both sides. And we think, if you're the kind of leader we believe you are, you'd want to know the real cost before any decision is made. There was a long silence.
Sen picked up the data chip from the table. He held it without looking at it. "I'll review your counter-proposal," he said. "That's all I'm prepared to commit to at this time." "That's all we're asking," she said. They left the way they always did, without ceremony, without looking back. Sen's senior aide was still reading the tablet screen when the door closed. He had not moved. "Thoughts?" Sen asked him. The aide looked up slowly. "I think," he said, "that we read their file, but we didn't read their file." Sen picked up the tablet. He sat with it for a very long time. Beyond the viewport, the station rotated its slow rotation, and the stars moved in their patient arc, and somewhere far beyond the neutral zone boundary was a planet with an ordinary sun and an extraordinary surface that had been building something for millennia without anyone out here knowing what it was building. He reached for the counter-proposal chip. He told himself he was only going to glance at it. He read it 4 times.
Nobody planned what happened on Cycle 11. There was no order behind it, no strategy, no escalation that either side had arranged or anticipated. It started with a young officer who misread a boundary coordinate and ended with a piece of footage that every senior member of the Dominion's military council would eventually watch in silence. The Dominion patrol cutter Vel Sharath was running its standard sweep near the outer edge of the neutral band when its sensors flagged a human survey vessel, a small ship built for deep mapping and atmospheric analysis. It had no weapons signatures. It carried 3 crew, a pilot, a systems technician, and a single security observer who had been assigned to the diplomatic mission as a precaution. The security observer was Warrant Officer Brea Holt. The patrol cutter's commanding officer was a sub-marshal named Greveth Talm. He was 26 cycles into his command rotation, and he had recently been reviewed favorably for promotion, which had given him a confidence that was not yet fully matched by his precision. He looked at the boundary reading on his sensor array. He looked at the position of the survey ship. He decided, based on his reading, that the human vessel had crossed into restricted Dominion space. His reading was wrong by approximately 400 kilometers, well inside the neutral zone's protected margin. He did not double-check. He ordered the boarding. 12 soldiers went through the magnetic lock in full combat armor. They were not expecting engagement. In the Dominion's considerable experience with smaller species, the appearance of 12 armored soldiers through an airlock ended the situation immediately. You showed the armor, you showed the weapons, you watched the hands go up. They came through the interior airlock into the main corridor of the survey vessel and found Brea Holt standing in the middle of it. She was not in armor. She had no firearm. She held a collapsible baton extended in her right hand. Her feet were planted slightly wider than her shoulders. Her weight was forward. She was not making threats. She was not retreating. She was looking at the 12 armored soldiers with the calm, measuring attention of someone who had already categorized the situation and arrived at her response. The lead soldier ordered her to stand down. The ship's translation system carried it into her language. Holt looked at the speaker panel. Then she looked back. "This ship is in neutral space," she said. Her voice was level, not loud, not shaking. "You do not have authority here. Leave through the lock you came in, and we'll treat this as a navigation error." The lead soldier raised his weapon and moved forward. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and 50 seconds. The ship's internal cameras captured every frame.
Holt did not wait for him to close the distance. She closed it herself, a decision that was so contrary to the expected behavior of an unarmored individual facing armed soldiers that the lead soldier's response was a full half-second behind where it needed to be. The baton came across the inside of his weapon arm before his trigger hand could complete the motion. The weapon pivoted away. She was already past him, using his body as a positional anchor against the soldiers behind, moving through the cluster of them the way current moves through a space, not by pushing against resistance, but by finding the path that resistance opens. She fought without hesitation and without wasted motion, not because she was fearless, but because the calculation had been finished the moment the airlock seal had broken. She knew what the situation was. She had known before the soldiers came through the door. What remained was simply execution. 7 of the 12 went down in those 4 minutes and 50 seconds. 3 impact strikes landed cleanly on her, the kind that, according to the Dominion's own combat medicine protocols, should have ended the engagement. She kept moving. She adjusted her balance, absorbed the force, and kept moving. The remaining 5 retreated through the airlock and sealed it. Holt stood in the corridor in the silence after. She was breathing hard. There were cuts along her right collarbone from the edge of a soldier's armor plate. A bruise was already forming across the left side of her jaw. She looked at the sealed airlock for a moment, then walked to the communication panel. Holt to Davan. The response was immediate. Go. Boarding attempt. 12 soldiers, no warning. Ship is secure. 7 on the floor. 5 went back through the lock. A pause. Short. Are you hurt? Cuts. Bruise. Nothing that matters. Our crew?
Sealed in the rear section. No contact with the soldiers. They're fine. Stay put. I'm contacting the station. The footage reached Sen's private terminal within 2 hours. He watched it alone, with his door closed and the room dimmed. He watched it once straight through. Then he went back to the beginning and watched it again, pausing at specific moments. The first movement, the positional transitions between opponents, the 3 impacts that landed and the seconds that followed each one. He called his chief military advisor. The advisor watched it twice in silence. On the second viewing, he paused it on the final frame. Holt standing in the corridor, 7 armored soldiers arranged on the floor around her, in the various positions where the engagement had left them. She is not exceptional, Sen said quietly, to himself as much to the advisor. He remembered what Davan had said at the second meeting, not exceptional by our standards. The advisor spoke carefully. The movement sequencing, she was not responding to each opponent individually. She was managing all of them simultaneously, using spatial control to deny them grouping ability. He paused. That is an advanced technique. Our best hand-to-hand instructors teach something similar. But the way she absorbed the impacts, he stopped. Then, 3 strikes that should have ended the engagement. By any measure we have for comparable body mass and armor configuration, any one of those should have finished it. She continued moving as if they hadn't happened, Sen said. Yes, the pain tolerance data. It's the only explanation. Sen stood and walked to the viewport. The station turned. Stars drifted. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the biological document that Stav had slid across the table. He thought about the counter-proposal chip he had read 4 times. He thought about the way Yael Davan sat at a table without a single betraying movement and waited with that absolute, unhurried patience for the other side to finish deciding what it thought it knew. He picked up his communicator and opened a direct channel to the human delegation. Davan answered. "Your warrant officer? Is she all right?" There was a brief silence. Then, "She's fine. Cuts and a bruise. She's already filed her incident report." "I want to formally apologize for the incident. My patrol officer misread the boundary. The error was ours." "We appreciate that. Commander, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead."
What I saw in that footage, is that typical for your military personnel? The pause on the line was not long, just long enough for Davan to decide the precise shape of the truth she was going to offer. "Brea Holt is very good at her job," she said, "but no, she's not considered exceptional by our military standards. She's solidly in the upper middle tier of her qualification level. We have training facilities on Earth where she would not be the most impressive person in the room." Sen closed his eyes for 1 full second. "I see," he said. "Ambassador," Davan said, "I think it's time we finished the conversation we started. I'd like to come in tomorrow, if the room is available." Sen looked at the frozen last frame still visible on his screen. 7 soldiers, 1 human, standing. "The room will be ready," he said. "Come in the morning." He ended the call and stood in the quiet. 27 years at this table, 22 species. He had always, without exception, known exactly what he was looking at. He had built an entire career on that certainty. He was no longer certain. That feeling was new. He did not like it, but he had spent enough time in this work to know that the moments that made him uncertain were the moments that mattered most. And for the first time since the human delegation had walked through the station door, Drovak Sen began to wonder whether the outcome of this negotiation was really as settled as he had written in his log. He suspected it was not. He was right. The council chamber felt different on the 4th meeting. Same table, same mineral cold air, same slow rotation of stars beyond the viewport. But the feeling had changed, the way the feeling in a room changes when people begin to understand that the ground they thought was solid is actually something different, not dangerous, not crumbling, just different from what they assumed. Sen's senior council members were both present this time. They had not attended the first 3 meetings. The fact that they were here now said something that nobody needed to say out loud. The humans arrived, and immediately the room shifted again, this particular shift being the kind that happens when people enter a space without carrying the weight that everyone expected them to carry. Davan was the same. Stav was the same. Holt stood near the door with the bruise yellowing at the jaw and the small bandaged cuts at her collarbone, and the same unhurried survey of the room she had maintained from the beginning. But there was a 4th person this time. She was introduced as Captain Sira Munde. She was compact, with close-cropped silver-streaked hair and eyes that were quiet and precise, and she moved to her seat with the controlled economy of someone who had spent a career learning how to carry herself in rooms where too much expression was a liability. She sat beside Stav and said nothing during the early portion of the meeting, and nothing about her stillness suggested discomfort. She simply waited for the part that was hers.
Davan addressed the boarding incident first. She laid it out plainly, the position of the survey vessel, the boundary error, and what had followed. She did not dramatize it. She did not leverage it. She stated the facts in the same level, clear register she applied to everything, and when she finished, she stopped and waited. Sen acknowledged the error formally. One of the senior council members delivered a statement of institutional regret. Davan received it with a nod and said that the matter was noted and that the human delegation was prepared to move forward. And then the real work began.
Sen placed the counter-proposal chip on the table. He had reviewed it 8 times. His advisors had mapped it section by section and come back with a consistent assessment. The document was not the work of a young civilization's hopeful idealism. It was the work of people who understood negotiation well enough to build a framework that sounded like compromise and actually functioned like equity, a genuinely different thing. "There are sections we can accept," he said. "There are sections that require further discussion." "That's what we're here for," Davan said. They went through it point by point. Trade access moved at pace. Both sides wanted movement on that front, and the language aligned more easily than Sen's advisors had predicted. The Dominion's existing template assumed a structure in which the larger partner held operational authority. The human document had replaced that structure with one requiring mutual agreement before any joint military action, with full veto rights on both sides. 2 of Sen's advisors pushed back on this clearly. The Dominion had agreed to arrangements with over 40 species and had never given any of them a genuine structural veto. It set a precedent that affected every subsequent negotiation in the framework. Davan listened to the objection each time it was raised. She did not argue against it. She said each time, in slightly different language, that the clause was not about limiting the Dominion. It was about building something that couldn't be broken by either side alone. That an agreement held together by force was not an agreement. It was a postponed confrontation. That what they were building here, if they chose to build it properly, was a foundation, not a ceiling. She said it without heat. She said it with the patience of someone who has a long view of where this is going and is willing to wait for the other side to arrive at the same view. On the 7th cycle of negotiations, the senior council members called a recess and stepped out of the chamber for 11 minutes. When they returned, the advisors did not raise the veto clause again. At some point in the middle of the afternoon session, one of the Dominion's economic analysts turned to Sarah Monday, who had been taking notes with quiet precision for 2 hours, and asked, carefully, as though the question might be impolite, if she could speak about Earth itself. Not the government, not the fleet or the trade projections, the planet. Monday looked at Davan. Davan nodded once. Monday set down her stylus and put her elbows on the table, and she talked. She talked about the oceans, not their size, but what lived in them. Creatures of enormous mass that breathed air and navigated by sound, communicating across hundreds of kilometers of open water in frequencies that humans had only learned to detect within the last 2 centuries. She described the deep water zones where pressure and darkness had produced biology so foreign to surface life that early human scientists had doubted their own instruments. She talked about the predator chains, the things with bone-crushing anatomy, the ones that hunted in coordinated groups using something that studied behavioral biologists still debated whether to call strategy. The ambush hunters that had evolved to dissolve into their environments so completely that human soldiers in certain terrain were still trained to treat the ground itself as potentially occupied. She talked about the ice periods, the long, deep cold that had swept across most of the planet's habitable zones and eliminated everything that could not adapt, and how the line between what survived and what vanished was often nothing more complicated than the willingness to change, to go farther, to eat something new, to move when everything in the biology said to stay. The species that crossed that line were still there. The ones that didn't were in the fossil record. She talked about the diseases, waves of biology that had swept through human populations and killed in numbers that were difficult to read on paper without pausing. And she talked about how humans had responded to those waves, not with acceptance, not with managed decline, but with systematic, targeted destruction. The hunting down of a biological enemy too small to see, with research and patience and an absolute refusal to accept that something could simply win. She listed several diseases that no longer existed on Earth because human beings had decided they should not exist and acted on that decision until it was true. She talked about the volcanic winters, the flooding events, the long dry centuries when the soil gave almost nothing and everything that required abundance died, and the humans who remained found ways to live on almost nothing and kept going. One of the senior council members had stopped looking at his papers. Both of them were listening. "You don't think of your world as a particularly dangerous place," one of them said, quietly, during a pause. Monday considered the question. "We have national parks," she said, "protected wilderness areas, places we've legally set aside so the land stays wild and the animals that live there remain free. We take our families to these parks on holiday. We walk through them. We sleep in lightweight shelters and cook over small fires and watch the dangerous animals from close range and think of it as a pleasant way to spend a weekend." She smiled briefly. "We call our world home because that's what it is. It's a beautiful place. It's also a place that spent a very long time determining what was allowed to stay on it. We were allowed to stay. It took a while." The room was quiet for a moment. Sen looked at Davan. "Tell me honestly," he said, "when I told you in our first meeting that the offer would become considerably less of an offer, were you concerned?" Davan thought about it. "We didn't want a conflict," she said. "Nobody in our delegation did, and nobody who sent us here did. But concerned the way you meant it, no. Because we understood the real cost of a conflict between us. We knew you didn't understand it yet." She paused. "We came back to the table instead of waiting because we didn't want either side to pay that cost. That's the whole truth of it." Sen was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. He picked up the counter-proposal document and wrote something in the cramped formal notation of official Dominion script across the top of the first page. He turned it around and slid it across the table. He had written, "Accepted as the basis for agreement." Davan read it. She did not smile or show relief or let any visible change move across her face. She simply nodded, and the pressure in the room came down slowly, the way pressure comes down from a sealed space when the seal is carefully, deliberately opened. For the first time in 4 meetings, something felt like it might genuinely be possible.
The final agreement took 13 more cycles to complete. It was not easy. Sen would not have trusted it if it had been. The best agreements were not easy. They were built in the long hours when both sides were tired, and the language of a single clause had been debated for the 3rd time, and the ventilation system was the loudest thing in the room, and everyone at the table still chose to keep working. There were two moments when the conversation came close to breaking. Once over the specific language governing military consultation timelines, and once over a taxation clause that the Dominion's economic advisors felt set a precedent they couldn't defend to the broader membership. Both times, Davan leaned forward and spoke in a low, precise voice that brought the argument back from the edge and into territory where progress was still possible. The Dominion advisors never asked exactly what she said during those moments. They didn't need to. The conversation continued. That was the point. The joint veto structure remained in the agreement. It had never been in any Dominion agreement before. The senior council members had pushed against it through the 9th cycle. On the 10th, they stopped. Sen did not ask them why, because he already understood. The clause was correct. Not convenient, not precedent-friendly, not easy to defend to the 42 species whose arrangements it implicitly rebalanced, but correct. An agreement that one side could override unilaterally was not a foundation, it was a cage, and whatever else humans were, they were not going to be housed in cages, and Sen had stopped pretending to himself that they were. Stav presented the economic analysis on the 6th cycle of the final negotiations. He had built a 10-cycle trade projection for both parties that was dense with data and precise in its assumptions, and he walked through it with the patience and clarity of someone who understood that the best way to persuade skeptical people was not to argue, but to show the numbers and let the numbers do the work. By the end of the session, the Dominion's most resistant economic advisor was asking him direct questions about human manufacturing infrastructure. Not strategic questions, the kind of questions a person asks when they have just realized they've significantly underestimated the size of a market. Bria Holt spent most of the final 13 cycles in the station's lower-level fitness facility or walking the corridor rings. She had no seat at the negotiating table, and that was not her function, and she understood that completely. But word had traveled.
The Dominion soldiers stationed on the level above the fitness facility had developed a habit. Every morning, a small group of them gathered at the observation window that overlooked the main floor and watched Holt run through her training. They watched her work through movement drills alone, baton techniques, close-quarter sequences against the heavy resistance equipment bolted to the floor, long, steady-pace endurance work that went on for durations that several of the watching soldiers found themselves quietly recalibrating their expectations around. Nobody said anything at the window. They just watched. Some of them started arriving earlier each day to see the beginning of the session. One young soldier who was technically scheduled for administrative duties was found at the window 3 mornings in a row by his supervising officer. The supervisor opened his mouth to say something about duty assignments. Then he looked through the glass at what the soldier was watching. He stood there for 7 minutes without speaking. He quietly rescheduled the soldier's administrative block to a different time and said nothing further about it. The signing was small. Both sides had agreed without much discussion that they did not want a ceremony. A ceremony was theater, and what had been built here was real, and real things did not need a stage. They signed in the same council chamber where the first meeting had taken place. Davan, Stav, Monday, and Holt on one side, Sen and both senior council members on the other. A simple recording device, the document, 2 marks pressed to paper. No speeches. Sen had thought about saying something prepared and decided against it.
Apparently, Davan had made the same decision, because she said nothing either. When the marks were set, they looked at each other across the table, and Sen extended his hand in the greeting gesture he had first seen Davan use, a gesture he had by now learned was called a handshake and carried a meaning that was older in human culture than most of the Dominion's governing institutions. Davan took his hand and pressed it firmly. "Good work," she said. "On both sides," he replied. The room emptied slowly. Monday left in conversation with the Dominion's economic advisor, the two of them still deep in a discussion about freight routing that had apparently begun before the signing and intended to continue well past it. Stav remained to complete the documentation transfer with the Dominion's legal recorder. Holt walked to the door, glanced back once at the room, measured it one final time, and was gone. Sen stood at the viewport. He had written in his first session log that the human system was unremarkable, a quiet star, a mid-tier planet, a young species that had not yet understood its own position. He had noted, as a contingency, that a fleet demonstration near their outer colonies would likely accelerate compliance if the 40-cycle review produced no agreement. He was glad the fleet stayed where it was. He thought about what that fleet demonstration would have meant, not strategically, but factually. The picture of what that collision of intentions would have produced. The biological data Stav had put on the table. The footage of Brea Holt survey vessel corridor, 7 armored soldiers around her, and 2 retreating through the lock. The picture of a species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years being tested by a world that did not forgive errors, and arrived at this table, this particular table, in this particular station, at the edge of neutral space, with something that no briefing file had thought to measure.
What I saw in that footage, is that typical for your military personnel? The pause on the line was not long, just long enough for Davan to decide the precise shape of the truth she was going to offer. "Brea Holt is very good at her job," she said, "but no, she's not considered exceptional by our military standards. She's solidly in the upper middle tier of her qualification level. We have training facilities on Earth where she would not be the most impressive person in the room." Sen closed his eyes for one full second. "I see," he said. "Ambassador," Davan said, "I think it's time we finished the conversation we started. I'd like to come in tomorrow, if the room is available." Sen looked at the frozen last frame still visible on his screen. 7 soldiers, 1 human, standing. "The room will be ready," he said. "Come in the morning." He ended the call and stood in the quiet. 27 years at this table, 22 species, he had always, without exception, known exactly what he was looking at. He had built an entire career on that certainty. He was no longer certain. That feeling was new. He did not like it, but he had spent enough time in this work to know that the moments that made him uncertain were the moments that mattered most. And for the first time since the human delegation had walked through the station door, Drovak Sen began to wonder whether the outcome of this negotiation was really as settled as he had written in his log. He suspected it was not. He was right. The council chamber felt different on the 4th meeting. Same table, same mineral cold air, same slow rotation of stars beyond the viewport,
But the feeling had changed, the way the feeling in a room changes when people begin to understand that the ground they thought was solid is actually something different, not dangerous, not crumbling, just different from what they assumed. Sen's senior council members were both present this time. They had not attended the first 3 meetings. The fact that they were here now said something that nobody needed to say out loud. The humans arrived, and immediately the room shifted again, this particular shift being the kind that happens when people enter a space without carrying the weight that everyone expected them to carry. Davan was the same. Stav was the same. Holt stood near the door with the bruise yellowing at the jaw and the small bandaged cuts at her collarbone, and the same unhurried survey of the room she had maintained from the beginning. But there was a 4th person this time. She was introduced as Captain Sira Munde. She was compact, with close-cropped silver-streaked hair and eyes that were quiet and precise, and she moved to her seat with the controlled economy of someone who had spent a career learning how to carry herself in rooms where too much expression was a liability. She sat beside Stav and said nothing during the early portion of the meeting, and nothing about her stillness suggested discomfort. She simply waited for the part that was hers. Davan addressed the boarding incident first. She laid it out plainly, the position of the survey vessel, the boundary error, and what had followed. She did not dramatize it. She did not leverage it. She stated the facts in the same level, clear register she applied to everything, and when she finished, she stopped and waited. Sen acknowledged the error formally. One of the senior council members delivered a statement of institutional regret. Davan received it with a nod and said that the matter was noted and that the human delegation was prepared to move forward. And then the real work began.
She finished the cold tea, stood, looked at the stars for another moment, at all the space out there, all of it still waiting, all of it still becoming whatever it was going to become. Then she went inside. There was a full brief in the morning. The trade convoy logistics needed her review. A second species, apparently a frequent trading partner of the Dominion, had sent a preliminary inquiry through the new joint communication framework. She was already looking forward to the work. Beyond the station, in the slow, cold dark between stars, the first joint convoy was in early planning. In 14 cycles, it would depart from a human port. It would carry goods that had not crossed that particular distance before. It would be crewed by both species for the first time in the history of either. It would not be the last convoy. It was the first of many, and everyone who had been in that council chamber knew it. The Varath Dominion had been arranging these meetings for a very long time. They had sat across from frightened species and struggling species and species that had wept when they finally pressed their mark to the page. They had always known what they were looking at. At the edge of neutral space, in a station with no name worth remembering that belonged technically to no one, the Dominion had finally sat down across from something they had not recognized until it showed them, and the thing they had not recognized looked back at them with dark eyes and folded hands and the absolute, weathered patience of a species that had been tested by everything its world had for longer than the Dominion had been keeping records, and it had not blinked. Not once.